Jake raised an eyebrow. Oh, you mean exposing the fact that you illegally changed HOA rules, tried to fine me for my own garage, and then attempted to break into my property? Yeah, Karen, I know exactly what I did. Her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. You ruined me, she shrieked. Jake tilted his head. Nah, you did that all by yourself. She let out a furious noise, something between a growl and a scream, and turned back to the movers. Jake watched, deeply enjoying every second as they hauled out her belongings. One by one, neighbors started to gather, whispering, exchanging amused glances. A few exchanged sly smiles. Then someone clapped. Jake turned to see old Mr. Hendrick from 3 houses down, standing in his bathrobe, slowly applauding. Then another neighbor joined in, and another. Within seconds, half the neighborhood was outside, cheering. Some even pulled out their phones to record the moment. Karen's entire body went rigid as she realized what was happening. She whirled around, face contorted in rage. You're all monsters! Jake chuckled. Nah, we just enjoy a good community event. The crowd roared with laughter. Karen, seething, stomped toward her car. Foam residue still clung to her tires from last week's disaster. She yanked open the door, threw herself inside, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life, and with one final screech of her tires, she peeled out of the driveway, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the tattered remains of her reputation. As the moving truck rumbled away, Jake turned back to the crowd, clapping his hands together. Well, folks, he said, grinning, I think we just had our first HOA-approved eviction. A loud cheer erupted. Someone popped a bottle of champagne. A few neighbors broke out into an impromptu dance party on Karen's now vacant driveway. Jake couldn't have asked for a better ending. With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt different, lighter. Conversations with neighbors were friendlier. No one lived in fear of some ridiculous fine for having their trash bins out a minute too long. And best of all, Jake could finally enjoy his home without the looming threat of HOA tyranny. But then, just when he thought the saga was finally over, his phone buzzed. Notification, viral video update. Jake's eyebrows lifted. He opened the app and immediately burst into laughter. Karen's foamy downfall had just hit another 1 million views. The clip of her screaming in the bubbles, the entire neighborhood celebrating her departure, it was everywhere. It got picked up by major meme pages. Twitter was on fire. Even news outlets had started covering the story. Jake scrolled through the comments, laughing at the sheer savagery of the internet. Oh, Karen gets the eviction speedrun any percent. She really thought she was the final boss. But my guy hit her with the ultimate counter. Bro turned his garage into a foam-powdered revolution, and I respect it. And then, there it was, the comment that sparked an idea. Yo, you gotta keep this going. Expose more insane HOA stories. Jake sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin. Maybe this wasn't just about his garage anymore. Maybe he had tapped into something bigger. A movement, a slow smirk stretched across his face. Karen was gone. But oh hey drama. Oh, it was just getting started. Bob shifted uncomfortably at the front of the room, flipping through a stack of HOA bylaws as though he were only now realizing just how deep Karen's corruption had run. So, turns out most of the rules Karen enforced were completely illegal, he admitted, rubbing his temple. A ripple of laughter spread through the assembled homeowners, some shaking their heads in exasperation, others openly chuckling. We're scrapping the garage-sharing policy, Bob continued, barely keeping the embarrassment out of his voice, voiding all fines issued under her leadership, and let's just say the HOA is about to be a whole lot less insane moving forward. Jake, lounging casually in the back row, grinned. Does this mean I get to keep my foam machine? Bob sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Jake, just don't use it as a weapon again. The room burst into laughter. It was perfect. The neighborhood, once a battlefield where Karen ruled with an iron fist, was suddenly normal again. People could leave their trash bins out an extra hour without fear of getting a ticket. Kids played in their yards without Karen scowling from her window. And best of all, Jake could finally enjoy his own property without HOA tyranny looming over him like a storm cloud. It should have ended there, but it didn't. A few days later, Jake woke up to chaos. His phone buzzed nonstop. Notifications flooded in from texts, emails, and social media alerts. Confused, he grabbed his phone and squinted at the screen. Breaking news! The HOA nightmare that went viral. Jake sat up so fast, his coffee nearly spilled. Karen's downfall, his foam-fueled rebellion, had officially hit the mainstream media. Clicking through the articles, he saw his garage turned foam party featured in news reports, reaction videos, even late-night talk show segments. A homeowner fights back against an overbearing HOA dictator. And folks, you have to see this footage. Viewers are calling it the most satisfying HOA takedown of all time. The internet is obsessed with HOA Karen's meltdown. Jake scrolled through the comments section, barely able to contain his laughter. This guy just did what we all dream of doing, petition to elect Jake as the new HOA president. Some men fight wars. Some lead revolutions. Jake drowns dictators in foam. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. What had started as one petty neighborhood dispute had become something bigger. He had tapped into something huge. And then, at the very bottom of the comment section, he saw it. Dude, you have to make this a series. Expose more HOA Karens. Jake sat there, staring at the screen, the idea forming in his head like a lightning strike. Maybe this wasn't just about his garage anymore. Maybe he had just unlocked something bigger. A movement. That afternoon, he grabbed his camera, stepped into his now Karen-free garage, and hit record. "Hey guys," he said, smirking. "So, what's the craziest HOA horror story you've ever heard?" The response? Explosive. Jake watched in awe as the numbers kept climbing. His inbox overflowed with messages from people across the country, homeowners, renters, even former HOA board members, all eager to share their own nightmare stories. Some were absurd, others downright infuriating. One person had been fined for having a too colorful garden. Another had been cited because their Christmas lights were up one day past the HOA deadline. But the ones that really caught Jake's attention, the full-blown HOA power trips. One comment stood out. "Dude, my HOA president threatened to tow my car from my own driveway because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. Can you help me expose these people?" Jake grinned. Oh, this was getting good. He fired up his camera and hit record. "All right, guys, so it turns out Karen was just the beginning," he said, smirking. "The HOA horror stories you sent in? Next level. So I think it's time we do something about it." He named the series HOA Hell, Exposing the Madness, and the internet ate it up. The more stories he covered, the bigger the movement grew. People weren't just watching, they were participating. Neighbors were secretly filming HOA board meetings. Homeowners were sending in documentation of shady fines and ridiculous regulations. Jake had unknowingly tapped into a nationwide frustration, and the floodgates had officially opened. One morning, he woke up to an email with a subject line that made him pause. "Jake, I have the ultimate HOA nightmare for you." He clicked it open, his curiosity piqued. "You think Karen was bad? Wait until you hear about the HOA president in my neighborhood. Let's just say she makes Karen look like a saint." Jake leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. Oh, this was about to be fun. My next step was to follow the money. As the legal owner of the neighborhood, I had access to the HOA's financial records, something Linda and her cronies clearly hadn't anticipated. What I found was worse than I expected. Tens of thousands of dollars labeled as maintenance fees that had never actually been used for maintenance. A discretionary fund that was essentially a bottomless pit for board members' extravagant business retreats at five-star resorts. And the most damning of all, a separate, off-the-books account where fine money had been funneled, completely unaccounted for. This wasn't just corruption, this was outright theft. Then, as if they sensed I was closing in, the HOA escalated. A new notice appeared on my door the next morning, this one more aggressive than the last. It wasn't just a fine, it was an eviction warning. Apparently my failure to comply with their absurd demands had reached a breaking point. According to the letter, I had 1 week to vacate my home before legal action would be taken against me. Me, the actual owner of the entire neighborhood. I almost laughed. They still had no idea who they were dealing with. Instead of fighting back immediately, I let them believe they were winning. I started collecting violations at an absurd rate, parking my car half an inch too far from the curb, leaving my trash bins out a few minutes past pickup, even daring to install a bird feeder that was apparently non-compliant. Every ridiculous fine they issued, I documented. Every bogus notice I saved. But the real fun began when I started reaching out to the homeowners again, this time with hard evidence. With every meeting, every conversation, more people came forward. Those who had been hesitant before were now emboldened, furious at the blatant abuse of power. What started as whispers of frustration turned into something louder, more determined. By the end of the week, we weren't just a group of disgruntled homeowners, we were a movement, and Linda, she was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to steal from the wrong landlord. Linda's face twisted in a mix of shock and fury, but the damage was already done. The room erupted in murmurs, homeowners exchanging bewildered looks, some whispering excitedly, others staring at me in stunned realization. A few who had lived under the board's thumb for years let out small, disbelieving laughs. I had just dismantled Linda's entire illusion of power in a single sentence, and she knew it. I let the silence linger, watching her scramble for some kind of control. This is absurd, she finally spat out, voice tight. The HOA operates under legally binding agreements. You can't just dissolve it with a wave of your hand. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. Really? Because according to these documents, I tapped the stack in my hand, flipping to a highlighted section. The HOA exists only because I allow it to, and since it's built on land I own, I can, in fact, revoke its authority at any time. Linda's jaw clenched, so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. She turned toward the board members, desperate for backup. "Are you seriously just going to let this happen?" she demanded. "Do something!" But they weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at me. I could see it in their faces, self-preservation kicking in. They had operated under the assumption that Linda was untouchable, but now with the entire community watching, it was clear who really held the cards. One of the board members, a balding man who had been nodding along to everything Linda said earlier, cleared his throat. I think we should maybe reconsider some of our policies," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact with her. Linda's eyes widened. "What?" she hissed, barely able to contain her rage. I chuckled. "You know, Linda, I almost have to admire your confidence. You really thought you could bully me out of my own property." "That's bold." I took a slow step forward, letting my words sink in. "But see, the problem with unchecked power, it makes you sloppy. You got so comfortable ruling over this place like a dictator that you forgot one very important thing. Eventually, people fight back." More murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement. I turned to face them. "How many of you have been fined for nonsense violations?" Nearly every hand went up. "How many of you have been threatened with legal action just for questioning those fines?" Again, a majority. I scanned the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. "Well, that ends today." Linda slammed a hand on the table. "You don't get to decide that," she snapped. "The HOA is still in control. We have legal grounds to enforce community compliance." I sighed dramatically. "You're really not getting it, are you?" I reached into my pocket, pulling out another document. "See, while you were busy handing out fake violations and using homeowners' money for vacations, I was busy filing this." I unfolded the paper and held it up. "A motion to dissolve the HOA, effective immediately." "Huh?" The silence was deafening. Linda looked like she had been physically struck, her hands clenched into fists as her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "You can't do that," she whispered, voice barely audible. I grinned. I already did. The reaction was immediate. Cheers, applause, even a few shouts of relief. Homeowners clapped each other on the back, some already laughing at the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. Meanwhile, Linda stood frozen, eyes darting around, looking for someone, anyone, to back her up. But the board was silent. They knew this was over. I turned back to Linda. "Pack up your clipboard," I said, voice light but firm. "Your reign is over." She stormed out without another word, and just like that, the HOA was gone. Linda's mouth opened, then closed, her face contorted in a mix of rage and disbelief. For the first time since this entire ordeal started, she had nothing left to say. No rules to twist, no threats to issue, no clipboard to hide behind. The iron grip she had held over this community for years had just been shattered. And she knew it. The homeowners, once hesitant and fearful, were beginning to realize the full weight of what had just happened. A murmur rippled through the room, slowly turning into excited whispers. People who had spent years being pushed around were finally free, and the reality of that was beginning to sink in. I let the moment breathe, watching as relief spread across the faces of those who had spent far too long under Linda's rule. "You have 30 days, I repeated, my voice steady but final. No fines, no legal battles, just leave. Linda's hands trembled as she clutched her clipboard like it was the last piece of control she had left. She turned wildly, searching for support among the board members, but they were already retreating, eager to distance themselves from her downfall. One of them, the same nervous-looking man from before, cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered, tugging at his collar, "perhaps it would be best if we, restructured things a bit?" I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, we're restructuring all right," I said, turning my gaze back to the crowd. "Starting now, we're tearing down every last bit of corruption that's plagued this neighborhood. Every single fraudulent fine will be refunded. Any homeowner wrongfully penalized will be compensated. And most importantly," I paused, sweeping my eyes across the room, "we're making sure that no one in this community ever has to live in fear of their own ho again." A woman near the front, her voice shaking, raised a hand. "So, does this mean the HOA is gone?" I smiled. "Not quite, but it means we're rebuilding it, from the ground up." The room broke into murmurs again, but this time the energy was different, hopeful. For so long these people had been beaten down, forced into submission by threats, fines, and intimidation, but now they had a voice. Now they had power. Linda let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You think you're some kind of hero?" she sneered. "You have no idea what it takes to run a community. This place is going to fall apart without structure, without order." I shrugged. "Funny, I was thinking the exact same thing about your leadership." Her nostrils flared, but she was out of ammunition. With one last glare, she spun on her heel and stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. The silence that followed was thick with tension, as if no one quite believed she was actually gone, but the second the door swung shut behind her, the dam broke. Applause. Cheers. A few people even clapped me on the back, shaking my hand like I had just won a championship game. But I wasn't the hero here, they were. The homeowners, who finally stood up for themselves, who refused to be bullied any longer, who realized that this was their community, not Linda's. "All right," I said, raising a hand to quiet the room. "We have work to do. First things first, new leadership." A few people exchanged glances. One older man chuckled, scratching his chin. "I think we know who should be in charge now," he said, nodding toward me. I shook my head. "Not me," I said firmly. "This community belongs to all of you. The people who actually live here should decide how it's run." A woman in the back smiled. "Then let's make sure we do it right this time." And just like that, the rebuilding began. With Linda gone and the truth exposed, the real work began. The celebration was short-lived, not because people weren't relieved, but because they knew this wasn't just about removing a tyrant. It was about undoing years of corruption and rebuilding the neighborhood into something fair, something people could actually call home without living in fear of arbitrary fines and intimidation. The financial records were just the tip of the iceberg. As I dug deeper, it became painfully clear just how much damage had been done. Money that should have gone toward community maintenance had been funneled into luxury retreats, personal shopping sprees, and even high-end furniture for Linda's office. A room no one had ever actually seen because it didn't exist. The so-called board member bonuses were nothing short of theft, a blatant abuse of power that had drained homeowners for years. At the next community meeting, I laid everything out. No more secrets, no more hidden accounts, just the truth. Tom, the older man who had been fined for excessive yard decorations, clenched his fists as he scanned the records. "They charged me $500 for a couple of garden gnomes while they were out renting yachts." His voice was tight with anger, and the murmurs around him only grew louder. A woman who had been fined for choosing the wrong shade of blue for her front door shook her head in disbelief. "So what now? Do we just move on?" I grinned. "Funny you should ask. Before Linda had even packed her things, I had already been on the phone with my lawyer. Embezzlement, fraud, misuse of funds. These weren't just HOA power trips. They were criminal offenses. We weren't just kicking them out, we were holding them accountable. The lawsuits hit hard. Bank accounts, frozen. Personal assets, investigated, and when some of them tried to claim ignorance, the receipts, emails, and board meeting transcripts proved otherwise. One by one, Linda's former board members fell like dominoes. Some settled quickly, desperate to avoid jail time. Others tried to fight back, but the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, the court ordered every stolen penny returned to the homeowners. But money wasn't the only thing that needed fixing. The entire system had to change. The first thing I did was wipe out every bogus fine Linda had ever issued. Homeowners who had been struggling under the weight of absurd compliance fees started receiving reimbursement checks in the mail. A few were so stunned they thought it was a scam, until they saw the official legal documentation attached. Next, I tackled the rules themselves. No more HOA-approved grass heights, no more surprise inspections for unapproved curtain colors, no more petty fines for parking an inch too close to the curb, and the best part, homeowners actually started celebrating their newfound freedom. One neighbor who had been fined for painting their mailbox the wrong color repainted it bright pink just because they could. A few houses down, someone else put up a giant inflatable dragon in their yard just for fun. Barbecues that had once been deemed too disruptive were now happening every weekend. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to feel like. Not a dictatorship, but a community. As I stood back, watching families finally relax, neighbors laugh together, and people live without fear, I knew we had done more than just take down a corrupt HOA. We had taken our home back. I strolled through the neighborhood. I couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. What was once a place of fear and pettiness had become a real community, one where people actually wanted to live. The suffocating rules were gone, replaced with a simple, resident-run committee that existed to help homeowners, not control them. And with the old HOA's iron grip finally broken, the transformation wasn't just visible, it was tangible. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact were now hosting block parties, chatting over fences, and helping each other with home projects. Yards that had been forced into sterile uniformity were now bursting with personality, colorful gardens, creative decorations, and yes, that giant inflatable flamingo still stood proudly on someone's front lawn. People were finally free to enjoy their own homes without fear of fines or threats. But the best part? The market had taken notice. Without an oppressive HOA scaring off buyers, property values skyrocketed. Homes that had been stuck on the market for months now had multiple offers. People who had felt trapped by restrictive regulations were suddenly free to sell at a real profit. It was ironic, really. The same homeowners Linda and her cronies had spent years bullying were now thriving, while she had been forced to pack up and leave in disgrace. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the change. The die-hard HOA loyalists, the ones who had thrived on policing their neighbors, grumbled about the decline of standards. But they quickly realized they were in the minority. Nobody missed the old HOA, nobody wanted it back, and without their endless complaints being turned into ridiculous fines, they didn't have much power left. One afternoon, as I passed by Linda's old house, now freshly repainted and already under contract, I spotted Tom, the retired veteran who had been fined for his American flag. He was standing outside, grilling an ice-cold beer in his hand. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, nodding toward the street, where kids rode their bikes without fear of being cited for using the wrong sidewalk chalk. I smirked. "Yeah? What's the verdict?" Tom took a sip of his beer, then grinned. "The best damn thing that ever happened to this place." I couldn't have agreed more. Linda might have thought she was untouchable, but in the end, justice won. The people won. The neighborhood won. And as for me, well, let's just say this was the most satisfying real estate deal I'd ever made. As I walked through the neighborhood, soaking in the sight of people finally at peace in their own homes, I knew we had done something that would last. Carl, the veteran who had once been fined over his flag, stopped me on the sidewalk, shaking his head with a grin. "You did good, kid," he said, clapping a firm hand on my shoulder. "Never thought I'd see the day where I could just live in my damn house without someone breathing down my neck." That was all the thanks I needed. But the real victory? What we did with the old HOA office, the very room where Linda and her board had once sat, smugly deciding which homeowner to squeeze dry next, was repurposed into a community center. No more closed-door meetings, no more secret fines, just an open space for neighborhood events, kids' activities, and real conversations about making the area better. It was no longer a place of fear, but one of connection. And as for Linda, last I heard she tried joining another HOA board in a different neighborhood, but poetic justice, her reputation preceded her, blacklisted. They thought they could push around the wrong person. They forgot one thing. The landlord always wins in today's society. Power thrives where people remain silent. Whether it's an overreaching HOA, an unfair workplace, or even larger systems that exploit the powerless. The lesson here? Know your rights, question authority, and never be afraid to stand up for what's yours. Bullies, whether individuals or organizations, rely on compliance. The moment people push back, their power crumbles. Think about your own life. Have you ever felt trapped by unfair rules? Been forced to accept something just because that's how it's always been done? What did you do, or what do you wish you had done? More importantly, how do we create communities that actually serve the people instead of controlling them? Let's talk about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or another situation where you had to fight for your rights? Let's hear your wildest stories.